Edinburgh, 1851. Margaret Bellamy learned on her wedding night that silence could be louder than grief. The house on Queen Street was new to her. Too orderly, too restrained, its tall windows admitting the pale Edinburgh light without warmth. The rooms smelled faintly of antiseptic soap and coal smoke, as though even the walls had been scrubbed of indulgence. Outside, the city hummed with the distant rhythm of carriage wheels and academic ambition, but inside the Bellamy residence, quiet ruled like law. She sat at the edge of the bed, gloved hands folded in her lap, the ivory silk of her gown whispering with each shallow breath. The fire burned low. The clock on the mantel ticked with surgical precision. Dr. Thomas Bellamy stood across the room, his back to her. He had not touched her since the ceremony. Not when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. Not when polite applause filled the kirk. Not even when the door closed behind them, sealing them into the expectation of marriage. He removed his coat with careful motions, as though undressing were an intellectual exercise rather than an intimate one. His dark hair, so meticulously arranged for public esteem, had loosened slightly, a single betrayal of the man beneath the physician. Margaret watched him through the mirror, her reflection pale and uncertain, a stranger wearing the title wife without instruction. "I have prepared the guest chamber," Thomas said at last. His voice was calm, neutral. The same voice he had used earlier that day to explain the progression of an illness to a group of students. Precise, considerate, distant. Margaret's heart stuttered. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, though she had heard him perfectly. He turned then, finally facing her. His expression was composed, his gray eyes thoughtful rather than cold, but there was something immovable in them, like stone shaped by long years of restraint. "You deserve peace," he said. "Not obligation." The words landed softly. That was the cruelest part. She had prepared herself for awkwardness, for shyness, even for disinterest. What she had not prepared for was rejection wrapped in courtesy. "I am your wife," Margaret replied, the sentence trembling despite her resolve. "Surely." "I will not touch you," Thomas said gently. "Not unless you wish it." Her breath caught. "That is kind," she managed, though the word tasted wrong. "But I do wish it. I believed." He raised a hand, not in dismissal but in quiet entreaty. "You need not explain yourself, nor defend your expectations. I simply ask that you trust my judgment." Trust. It was a strange request from a man who would not explain himself. That night, Margaret lay alone beneath unfamiliar covers, listening to the house breathe around her. Somewhere down the corridor a door closed softly. Footsteps retreated. Distance settled between them like a second wall. She stared at the ceiling until dawn, wondering what manner of marriage began with separation, and whether she had already failed it. The weeks that followed established a rhythm as exacting as Thomas's surgical rounds. Breakfasts were cordial, conversations brief. He inquired after her comfort, her meals, her sleep. He never failed in courtesy, never raised his voice, never crossed a boundary, and never crossed the space between them. Margaret learned quickly that Dr. Bellamy was revered within Edinburgh's medical circles. Students bowed to him in the street. Professors deferred to his research. His colleagues spoke his name with a mixture of admiration and awe, as though he were less man than instrument, precise, brilliant, untouchable. At home he was the same. He left early, returned late. His hands often smelled of carbolic acid, his cuffs faintly stained with the labor of saving lives. When she asked about his day, he answered honestly, but without invitation. Always information, never intimacy. At first, Margaret told herself she was fortunate. Many women endured far worse. She had security, respect, a place within the academic elite. No cruelty marked her days. No harsh words. Yet loneliness does not require violence to thrive. It crept into her evenings, into the pauses between sentences, into the untouched gloves she folded away each night. It lived in the way Thomas never looked at her too long, as though desire were a contagion he refused to contract. Once, only once, she reached for his hand as they stood together at the window, watching rain sweep across the stone street below. He stiffened. Not in disgust. In fear. "I beg you," he said quietly. "Do not mistake my restraint for indifference." She withdrew at once, mortified by her own yearning. "I would never," she whispered. But the truth was harder. She did not know what his restraint meant at all. It was in the anatomy lecture hall that Margaret first felt seen again. She had accompanied Thomas to the university at his urging. "You have a sharp mind," he had said once offhandedly, as though intellect were merely another observable trait. His colleague, Professor Andrew Carlyle, noticed her attentiveness immediately. "You follow the discussion," Carlyle remarked one afternoon, handing her a pamphlet. "Most spouses endure these lectures. You appear to consider them." Margaret flushed. "I enjoy thinking." Carlyle smiled, not with flirtation but with warmth. "A dangerous habit in Edinburgh. You will find few who reward it." They spoke afterward. About literature. About ethics in medicine. About the weight of knowledge and the loneliness of carrying it. Carlyle listened in a way Thomas did not because Thomas was unkind, but because he was absent even when present. Margaret told herself it was harmless. Yet rumors are born not of sin but of proximity. A glance held too long. A laugh overheard. A woman who smiled again after too many silent months. Margaret noticed the whispers before Thomas did. What she did not know, what she could not know, was that Thomas watched from the margins, his composure beginning imperceptibly to fracture. Because silence had always been his shield. And shields, once cracked, reveal the wounds beneath. Edinburgh learned to recognize Margaret Bellamy as a figure of quiet distinction. She walked the stone streets with measured grace, her gloved hands folded neatly, her expression composed enough to invite respect rather than curiosity. As the doctor's wife, she was granted entry into drawing rooms and academic salons where ideas mattered more than charm, at least in theory. In practice, she learned quickly that a woman's intellect was praised only when it remained decorative. Except by one man. Professor Andrew Carlyle greeted her each week with open warmth, his eyes lighting not with appraisal but recognition. He listened, truly listened, when she spoke of her thoughts on moral responsibility in medicine, on the emotional toll exacted by scientific detachment, on how progress often demanded a cruelty society preferred not to name. "You think like a philosopher," he told her one afternoon as they stood beneath the arched windows of the university library. "Not many do." Margaret smiled, though the praise carried an ache. "I was not encouraged to think at all once I became a wife." Carlyle frowned. "That is a grievous waste." He did not say Thomas's name. He did not need to. Their conversations never strayed beyond propriety, yet they filled a space in Margaret that had grown hollow with neglect. She found herself anticipating those hours, measuring her weeks by moments of being heard. At home, silence still ruled. Thomas noticed her brightness before he understood its cause. She played the pianoforte again, softly at first, testing notes as one might test a fragile limb after injury. Books appeared on her bedside table, volumes she had borrowed from the university library, filled with marginal notes in her careful hand. She asked sharper questions at dinner. Her mind seemed awake in ways he had not yet earned the right to share. He observed these changes with a tightening chest. Not anger. Fear. That fear had a name, though he had never spoken it aloud. Desire. Thomas Bellamy had learned early what desire did to people. In the wards of the Royal Infirmary, he had seen young women brought in half-conscious, bleeding from unsafe procedures, abandoned by men whose promises dissolved at the first whisper of consequence. He had watched mothers weep over daughters ruined not by illness, but by affection misplaced. He had treated men too, men whose passions excused their cowardice, who spoke of love while fleeing responsibility. desire he believed made liars of good intentions. And so, when Margaret became his wife, radiant and intelligent and dangerously capable of being loved, he had sworn to himself that she would not be destroyed by him. He would not awaken longing he could not guarantee to protect. Restraint to Thomas was not neglect. It was mercy. But mercy, he was beginning to understand, could wound as deeply as cruelty when imposed without explanation. The rumors reached him in fragments. A colleague's raised brow. A student's ill-timed jest. A question framed too carefully to be innocent. "Your wife has quite the mind," someone remarked during a faculty dinner. "Carlyle speaks of her often." Thomas smiled thinly. "I should hope so. She is remarkable." Yet the word often echoed unpleasantly. That night he returned home earlier than usual. Margaret was seated by the fire, a book resting forgotten in her lap. She looked up at his entrance, surprise flickering across her features. Then pleasure quickly masked. "How was the infirmary?" she asked. He removed his gloves slowly. "Busy." Silence followed. He wanted to ask where she had been that day, with whom she had spoken, whether Carlyle's voice still lingered in her thoughts. He asked nothing, and she, perhaps sensing the invisible wall between them, said nothing more either. The distance stretched. It was unbearable in its civility. The turning point came on an afternoon heavy with mist. Margaret had remained at the university longer than intended, caught in conversation with Carlyle beneath the colonnade. He spoke of a paper he was preparing on ethical responsibility in experimental medicine, his tone animated. "You should write," he said suddenly. "Your perspective would be invaluable." She laughed softly. "No one would publish a doctor's wife." "Then they would be fools," Carlyle replied. The words were innocent. The way he looked at her was not. And that, more than anything, was what Thomas saw as he approached. He halted unseen, his breath catching at the sight of Margaret's face turned upward, alight with engagement. She looked alive in a way she had not looked with him. Something sharp and unfamiliar pierced his chest. Jealousy, yes, but not of Carlyle. Of himself. That night Thomas did not retreat to his study. He remained in the drawing room as Margaret embroidered by the fire, the thread trembling slightly between her fingers. "You enjoy the university," he said at last. She paused. "I enjoy conversation." The honesty struck him harder than accusation. "And do you find it lacking here?" he asked carefully. Margaret lowered her work. "I find," she said, choosing each word with the same care he brought to his surgeries, "that silence when shared can be comforting. But silence endured alone becomes something else entirely." Thomas closed his eyes. He had meant to protect her. Instead he had abandoned her to loneliness. That night, for the first time since their marriage, sleep did not come to him at all. Because for the first time he allowed himself to imagine the unthinkable. Margaret's warmth offered to another. Her laughter not restrained by courtesy. Her mind cherished elsewhere. And the thought did not merely frighten him. It broke him. Margaret did not intend to become the subject of speculation. Yet Edinburgh was a city built on observation. Stone upon stone, reputation upon reputation. A woman could not walk twice in the same direction without being noticed, measured, discussed. She felt the shift before she heard the words. Invitations grew cautious. Conversations paused when she entered a room. Smiles carried a curious sharpness, as though something unsaid hovered just beneath courtesy's thin veneer. It was Mrs. Grant, kind-hearted and incapable of cruelty, who finally spoke. "You must forgive me for asking, my dear," she said one afternoon over tea, her fingers tightening around her porcelain cup. "But are you content?" The question struck like a blade wrapped in velvet. Margaret's pulse quickened. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Grant sighed. "People notice things. Your husband's distance. And your friendship with Professor Carlyle." The name landed with dull finality. "There is nothing improper," Margaret said at once. "Nor would there ever be. I know, Mrs. Grant replied softly. But society rarely cares for truth when imagination is more entertaining. Margaret returned home shaken. Not by guilt. By the sudden understanding that her marriage, already fragile in its silences, now stood exposed to judgment. And Thomas had not been prepared. He learned of the rumors in the wards. A student spoke carelessly. A nurse glanced away too quickly. Whispers followed him like infection. At first he dismissed them. Then he heard Carlyle's name paired with Margaret's in a tone that carried suggestion. Something inside Thomas cracked. The hospital corridor blurred around him, the past rushing forward unbidden. Blood-stained sheets. A girl no older than Margaret had been at marriage, eyes glassy with fear, abandoned by a man who had sworn devotion. Another patient. Another ruined life blamed on feminine weakness, rather than masculine desire. Desire destroyed. That had been his creed. And yet, the thought of Margaret's name being spoken with such implication ignited a pain he could not cauterize. That evening he returned home before dusk, his hands trembling beneath his gloves. Margaret was in the sitting room, her posture rigid as she looked up at him. He saw at once that something was wrong. Thomas. He did not remove his coat. Have you been with Carlyle today? He asked. The question was not accusation. It was fear laid bare. Yes, she said carefully. At the university. He exhaled sharply, a sound of defeat rather than anger. The rumors are unkind, he said. They speak of you as though. His voice faltered. As though you were unguarded. Margaret stood. I have been nothing but guarded, she said, her voice shaking. By you. The truth of it struck him like a blow. I have given you nothing, she continued, tears gathering despite her resolve. Not affection. Not explanation. Not even the courtesy of honesty. And now you fear what your absence has made possible. Silence roared between them. Thomas turned away, bracing his hands on the back of a chair as though the furniture itself were the only thing keeping him upright. I feared this, he whispered. She froze. Feared what? He laughed once, bitter and broken. That my silence would wound you. That my restraint would become cruelty. That you would seek warmth where I refused to offer it. Margaret's chest ached. Then why, Thomas? Why choose this marriage if you intended to remain untouched by it? He closed his eyes. Because to answer meant dismantling everything he had built to survive. I have seen what men do when they love without courage, he said at last. I have watched desire excuse abandonment. I have watched women bear the cost of men's wanting. She said nothing. I swore, he continued, his voice unsteady, that I would never be that man. That I would never claim a woman's body without ensuring her safety, her dignity, her choice. Margaret's breath caught. You believed love itself to be the danger, she said softly. Yes. And so you denied it, she finished. He turned then, his eyes haunted. I denied myself. The words shattered something in her. You did not spare me, she said gently. You left me alone inside a marriage that had no pulse. He stepped closer without realizing it. And yet, he whispered, the thought of you belonging to another. He stopped. His hands clenched at his sides, trembling with a violence he did not trust himself to release. Say it, Margaret urged, her heart racing. It terrifies me, he confessed. Not because I doubt your virtue, but because I know my own longing. The room seemed to tilt. He looked at her then, not as physician, not as protector, but as man stripped of pretense. I want you, he said. And that knowledge frightens me more than any injury I have ever treated. Margaret's tears spilled freely now. Then learn, she said, stepping into the space he had kept sacred and empty for so long. Learn that loving me is not a sin. Her hand hovered near his chest. He did not stop her. He did not move away. And in that moment, Thomas Bellamy realized that the greatest danger he had ever faced was not desire, but the possibility that he might lose her without ever daring to reach. Thomas did not sleep that night. Nor did Margaret. The house seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves sensed that something long restrained had begun to stir. The familiar ticking of the clock no longer sounded orderly. It felt accusatory, counting the moments Thomas had wasted in fear. When dawn came, pale and hesitant, Margaret was already awake, seated by the window with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She watched the city emerge from shadow. Students hurrying along cobblestones, smoke rising from chimneys, life proceeding as it always had, unaware that within one quiet house, a marriage stood on the edge of transformation. Thomas found her there. He stopped in the doorway, struck by the sight of her in morning light. She looked smaller than she had the night before, as though the courage she had summoned now exacted its price. Guilt settled heavy in his chest. "I have wronged you," he said. She did not turn. "You have feared me." "Yes," he replied. "And in doing so I made you bear that fear alone." He crossed the room slowly, as though sudden movement might shatter what little trust remained. When he reached her side, he did not touch her. "Not yet. The rumors," he said quietly. "They will cease." Margaret looked up at him then, searching his face. "How?" "Because I will no longer allow the world to imagine that you stand unclaimed," he answered, and then softer, "or unloved." The word trembled between them. He swallowed. "Thomas." "I do not mean possession," he said quickly, reading the tension in her posture. "I mean presence, devotion, visibility. I will no longer hide my regard as though it were a disease." Tears blurred her vision. "For years," he continued, "I believed that wanting you would make me dangerous. But I see now that denying you has made me cruel." His voice broke on the last word. Margaret rose slowly, facing him fully. "Do you know what hurt most?" she asked. "It was not that you would not touch me. It was that you would not see me wanting you." Thomas reached out then, hesitated, and finally placed his hand over hers, reverent as prayer. "I see you," he said. "And God forgive me, I have always seen you." Her breath shuddered. That day he walked with her through the university halls. Not a step behind. Not distracted. But beside her. Whispers followed, yes, but so did silence. The kind that forms when speculation collides with certainty. Thomas's hand rested at the small of her back, protective without being possessive. When Carlyle greeted them, Thomas met his gaze without hostility, only unmistakable claim. Margaret felt it like a shield around her spine. That evening, Thomas dismissed his study early. He did not retreat. He did not busy himself with papers or charts or the comforting cruelty of distance. Instead, he knocked on her door. She opened it with trembling fingers. "I will not enter unless you ask me to," he said. The words undid her. She stepped aside. Inside, the room felt changed, not because anything had moved, but because he had crossed a boundary he once sanctified with fear. He stood uncertainly, like a man entering unfamiliar terrain. "I do not know how to be gentle without being absent," he confessed. "Or passionate without being reckless." Margaret took his hands. "Then learn," she said. "With me." Slowly. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against hers. "I was jealous," he admitted, shame coloring the word. "Not because another man desired you, but because you were alive in ways I had forbidden myself to touch." She smiled through tears. "Jealousy does not shame you. It tells me you care." He kissed her then. Not urgently. Not hungrily. But as one might test faith after long doubt. The kiss was soft, trembling, as though he feared she might vanish beneath his lips. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I will spend the rest of my life making amends," he said. Margaret rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady human proof of his heart. "You need not atone," she whispered. "Only remain." That night when he finally held her, fully, truly, It was not conquest that marked the moment but arrival. A man stepping into the life he had been too afraid to deserve. Love did not arrive in Margaret Bellamy's life as a grand upheaval. It settled. That, she learned, was the difference between longing and belonging. In the weeks after Thomas crossed the threshold he had feared for so long, their house changed in ways no visitor could have named outright, yet everyone felt. Silence no longer lingered like a reprimand. Softened. It became companionable, a pause between shared thoughts rather than a wall. Margaret woke each morning to the steady presence of him beside her, not always touching but always there. Some days they spoke little. Others they talked until the fire burned low and the city outside surrendered to sleep. What mattered was not the quantity of words, but their permission to exist. He watched Thomas relearn himself. He moved differently now, less guarded in his gestures, less rigid in posture. He laughed, quietly at first as though the sound surprised him. His eyes followed her with an attentiveness that no longer disguised itself as duty. And when he touched her, it was never hurried, never claimed, but offered again and again as choice. Margaret had not realized how deeply she had feared becoming small until she felt herself expand. Society, ever watchful, took note. The rumors faded, not because they were confronted but because they became irrelevant. Thomas escorted her openly, listened when she spoke, deferred to her judgment in rooms where women were expected only to smile. At a medical dinner one evening, a young physician posed a question regarding patient ethics. Margaret answered before Thomas could, her voice steady, her reasoning incisive. The room fell silent. Thomas did not interrupt. He watched her with unmistakable pride. Later that night, when they returned home beneath a sky veined with stars, Margaret said softly, "You did not rescue me by loving me." Thomas turned to her, curious. "You trusted me to remain myself," she continued. "That was the rescue." He took her hand, pressing it briefly to his lips. "I thought love was restraint," he said. "Now I see it is courage sustained." The hospital still claimed much of Thomas's time, but it no longer claimed him entirely. He spoke to her of his patients, not as cases but as people. He admitted when a loss haunted him, when a decision weighed heavily. Margaret listened without trying to mend what could not be undone. In return he encouraged her writing. It began as notes, observations on ethics, on women in medicine, on the quiet violence of neglect. Thomas arranged for her work to be read anonymously. When a journal accepted her essay he said nothing at first. Then one evening he placed the publication gently into her hands. "They will know your name soon enough," he said. "But this is the beginning." She wept, not from disbelief but recognition. She was not merely a doctor's wife. She was herself. Years passed, not marked by dramatic milestones but by accumulation. Shared mornings. Familiar gestures. The slow, unglamorous labor of choosing one another again and again. When their first child arrived, a daughter with Margaret's eyes and Thomas's quiet focus, the fear returned briefly, uninvited. Margaret saw it in the way Thomas held the infant, his hands careful, his breath unsteady. "Do not be afraid," she told him. "I am not afraid of loving her," he said. "I am afraid of failing her." Margaret rested her head against his shoulder. "Then let her see you try." He did. With gentleness. With humility. With a devotion that did not demand perfection, only presence. One autumn evening, long after the house had settled and the city had quieted, Margaret stood at the window, watching rain trace patterns across the glass. Thomas joined her, his arms slipping around her waist with ease born of years. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. He did not ask what she meant. "No," he said without hesitation. "Do you?" She considered. "I regret the years we lost to silence," she said. "But not the path that brought us here." He kissed her temple. "Nor I." They stood together in the hush, not as physician and wife, not as protector and protected, but as equals who had chosen one another without illusion. Margaret understood then what love truly was. Not passion unrestrained. Not sacrifice demanded. Not fear disguised as virtue. Love was the quiet decision to remain present. To speak when silence tempted. To touch without ownership. To see and be seen, fully, imperfectly, and without retreat. She turned to Thomas, resting her forehead against his. "We are not ruined," she said softly. "No," he replied. "We are redeemed." Outside, Edinburgh slept, unaware that within one unremarkable house, a marriage once defined by distance had become something rarer than brilliance or devotion. It had become safe. And in that safety Margaret Bellamy had found not only love, but freedom. And so, in a world that once taught them fear, Margaret and Thomas learned a quieter truth. That love does not demand surrender. It invites presence. What began as a marriage of silence became a sanctuary of choice. Not because passion burned brightest, but because two wounded souls found the courage to remain. To listen, to see, to touch without fear. If this story stirred something in you, if you found yourself breathing more slowly, or lingering in the pauses between their words, then you have already understood the heart of Charlotte's title whispers. This is where love unfolds gently, where longing is honored, where stories are told not to rush the heart but to hold it. If you're drawn to romances where emotional depth matters more than haste, if you crave stories of quiet devotion, healing, and chosen intimacy, then subscribe to Charlotte's title whispers, and let these whispered tales meet you again. In the still hours. In the spaces between noise. Where the heart listens best. Until next time, rest here a little longer.